Today, I'm very excited to have Arvind Radhakrishnan on the podcast. Arvind is a long-standing figure in Indian startups and venture capital. Arvind is currently the associate director of WeWork Labs, a startup incubator that is focused on supporting entrepreneurs from the end-to-end life cycle of an early-stage startup. Arvind also previously founded 21 Dojo, a platform that assessed 21 holistic metrics of startups to give investors the insight that they needed to make investments, as well as give startups the exposure that they wanted to raise capital. It was great having Arvind on the podcast because his experience as both a founder and investor and playing both sides of the coin leads to some really unique insights, as well as getting a broader understanding of the Indian startup ecosystem, an ecosystem that the whole world is now paying attention to, and I think is very unique compared to the rest of the world. But with that said, I hope you enjoy the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Building Blocks podcast. Today, I have Arvind. Arvind, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Davik. I'm super excited.
Yeah, and I'm super excited to have you on as well. You know, you've been a long-standing figure in the Indian venture capital and startup areas, and super excited to dive into your experience. But before we get more in depth, I love to start with your story first. So, what brought you into the world of startup investment and growth?
So I think that's how much time do we have? Because that might take a while. It's always been. I think I've always been on the business side. I think if I could redo life, I would do it on the tech side. But just
Hmm.
the way things worked out, it's always been on the business side. From my academic life, I did my high school in Botswana, and I was in the commerce and sort of the commerce finance business stream that translated into my university in South Africa, which was on in economics and finance. And then I did
Mm.
my master's in finance and investment. And then I did my CFA. So it's always sort of gone narrower and narrower into the world of investments and finance. That was sort of the natural path that it took. And my first job. So once I got back to India about 13 years ago, I got into investment banking, which was the first my first whatever job in the Indian ecosystem. I think
Right.
just by virtue of the fact that the ecosystem itself at that point was quite young, and
Hmm.
you had Flipkart and all these household names now just growing up back then. I was in the investment banking division, but I never actually worked on true investment banking deals. I worked more on startup fundraising deals because that's just where the ecosystem was in 2012. And that gave me my first sort of taste of the startup world and the investment world in the early stage and things like that. So that's what got me really excited. I actually left Deloitte after a couple of years because I loved the founder journey, right? So
Right.
I sort of took a semi-calculated risk to jump into that area. I can talk for a long time about what I did after that, but yeah, that's sort of what got me into it in the first place.
Okay, yeah, and we'll dive into that. Leading up to experience into now leading WeWork Labs. But let's get into WeWork Labs to begin with, and we'll sort of work our
Sure,
way backwards.
amazing,
I think so. I personally am a very big fan of WeWork as an organization. I have a WeWork membership, and
amazing.
I just think the way you guys are able to establish community across the world, like even in complete different areas, right? Like I'm in at San Francisco, and the WeWork community is bustling there. It's a lot of startup people and a lot of people, freelancers, and a lot of just people trying to make it big. And I go to
Yep,
Delhi, and even though it's vastly different, that same thread is still there, and the ability for you guys to make community and for to make your members feel welcome no matter where is a huge deal.
I
And I
agree.
think just naturally, even though of course WeWork Labs is different in terms of the work you guys do, that natural thread is just there across the organization. So yeah, no, very very big fan about with WeWorks, and the more I read about WeWork Labs, it seems like a lot of that same community aspect and the supporting entrepreneurial aspect is prevalent there as well. So before I go too much into just being a fanboy of WeWork, let me go more deep into the WeWork Labs. As part of your job, you're looking into integrate startups and new founders to invest in, and people who you think can really make a difference here. So, what are those traits that you look for when you're evaluating founders and startups?
So that's interesting. So I think it's a bunch of different things. I think what's interesting and what's always sort of drawn me to this space is it is very much a combination of qualitative and quantitative factors. Quantitative, and in 21 Dojo, which was my first startup, this was the entire problem statement, right? It was
Hmm.
how do you actually find at the very early stage when you have barely any validation of any kind, you pretty much have the founder's conviction and these sort of flimsy signs from the market. How do you see if it's actually a good investment to make? I think this is an endlessly fascinating question because at its
Hmm.
core, what it's answering is how do you spot value? How do you spot value? How do you spot these agents of change? And I think that's just very exciting on many levels. I think the qualitative aspects are harder to judge, so maybe I'll start with the quantitative ones, right? So
Right.
you have your main ones, and 21 Dojo. This is slightly aside, but 21 Dojo comes from the fact from we actually got the name because there were 21 factors that we identified that sort of
Okay.
address the investors' concerns about whether this is a good enough start. So 21 factors that should be analyzed, but the big three, especially in the early stage, which I think I'll stick to in my answer because that's where my experience is. The big three are obviously the team. The team is a huge part of the decision.
Of course.
Beyond that, it's the market, and beyond that, it's the product and the pain point that's actually being solved, right? So I think in that order, and then beyond, I mean, apart from these three, you have your attraction, you have your scalability, your competitive advantage, you have your exit opportunities, your distribution channels, all of those things. But I think when you listen to a pitch in the first go, the things you're evaluating and you're thinking about is these big three sort of factors. The qualitative ones are often it's probably a bigger factor on a day-to-day basis about how well the startup operates, and it's your things like the grit that the founder has, the relationship between the founding team, the integrity that the founding team has, and the way they operate. So those things are harder to judge, and I think that
Yeah.
only comes with actually building a deeper relationship with the founder. But yeah, that would be my quick answer.
No, that makes sense, man. I think I've talked to a couple different people who are in startups and investors, and I think that team part is always central. Like a lot of them even go so far to say that even if I believe they're going in the wrong direction, and I don't necessarily think their idea will work, I have
Yeah,
enough trust that the team will figure it out, that I will
exactly.
invest in that startup for that reason. And I think it's really interesting because a lot of people spend so much time trying to figure out, oh, is this the right problem, the right space? Which no doubt is very important, but they
Right.
don't even look around them like, who are they building this thing with, and are they people who are actually in it for the right reasons and will stick with trying to build something big.
Exactly. That's actually a fourth point because the founder mindset of not seeing it as a quick like path to profit, path to like personal wealth creation, and seeing it as a long term and like endeavor that they can build value with. I think that's a huge piece of that decision as well. Yeah,
100%. Yeah. And I think resiliency is tested very quickly. And it's something
oh
that
yeah,
just keeps testing the founder, even as they start to scale.
100%.
Um,
Yeah.
So that makes a lot of sense, and I'm very curious to actually know about these factors with 21 Dojo, but I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself. So I'll keep it to WeWork Labs for now before we get into 21 Dojo.
Awesome.
But I think what's really interesting with WeWork's Lab is the program that you guys have for your entrepreneurs, right? And
Yeah.
I went on this little aside talking about the community aspect of WeWork, but it seems like that's something you guys have within your accelerator program as well. So, like, what are the main tenets you think are really important for any great accelerator program, and how do you guys believe you're doing that at WeWork Labs?
Oh, that's a great question. So this is something we've put a lot of thought into from the very beginning. So, quick background: WeWork Labs has been around almost as long as WeWork has, right? So, in
Mhm.
India, WeWork started in 2017, and since about 2018, we've had WeWork Labs. And our mission has always been, I think, one key thing that any accelerator in the world, should have clarity on is which stage of the entrepreneurial journey they are looking to intervene and add value to, because
Yep.
that dictates the rest of it. So we were very certain that we want to be at the very early stages, right? This is when we thought the value of the community that you mentioned earlier, this global community, etc., and the interventions we were able to do as a WeWork Labs team um, was strongest. The impact we could have was strongest at the very early stages. So we've spent a lot of time figuring out what those pain points are. That regardless of if it's your first time doing, building a company, or if it's your fifth time, we put a lot of thought, a lot of effort, a lot of research into what those barriers are. So now what we've done is we've sort of built our entire program around those barriers. The barriers are basically initially like idea validation and product validation. That's something you could be doing your first startup or your fifth. You would need to validate your product. That is something we focus on. Beyond actually, once you validated your idea on your product, the first thing you need to do is start getting customers, right? You need
Yeah.
to start testing out with customers, seeing if it resonates with the market at all. So actually getting those early customers, getting that early traction is the second piece. Doesn't matter how many times you've done this. The third piece is once you've got those customers, how do you expand your market? So
Yeah.
that's the next thing that we focus on. We've got a program around. Once we've done that, which we call our ecosystem pillar, we move to the talent side. Every founder in the world knows how painful this pillar is to solve. Whether you're hiring at the co-founder level, you're hiring at the on the tech side, the non-tech side, finding good talent, retaining them, engaging them, super hard. So we have an entire talent pillar just for that. After that is actually when, and this is something that is really hard to solve, but we've made some progress in it, is advice. So actually,
Mm.
building a network that our founders and the founders out there in the ecosystem who engage with us can tap into and actually draw value from. So a mentor network, right? Super hard to handle at a national level, which is what we try to operate at, because you have to have the vertical specific mentors, you have to have ones who can do sales, legal, finance, all these horizontal mentors, and actually find time on all these really accomplished individuals' schedules to actually give back to the founder community. So it's a very hard problem to solve, but that is definitely a core area that accelerators should focus on, is building an actually accessible and value creating mentor network. I think that's big. And then finally, obviously, there are some accelerators that do this through their own capital, which is
Yeah.
the fourth pillar is actually capital. And there's some that rely on networks, etc., to do it. But I think actually infusing capital that allows promising companies to scale, that is the bloodline of a company of any size. So I think that's an important component.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think I resonate like doing an early stage startup. I definitely resonate with all four verticals, and I think
Right.
you guys really have the whole founder experience very very spelled out here. And what's
Thank
really
you.
cool with it is although they're oh sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying thank you. Thanks for saying
Oh
that.
yeah, yeah. And one thing is really what's really interesting here is everybody sees them as four distinct pillars, but they also merge with one another, right? Like if you have a great mentor network, then that can be a first angel investor for these startups, right? Because typically they're looking for different investments. Or with the talent and the network aspect, I think the best founders are not only great engineers and great salesmen, but they're actually great recruiters, or at least one person on the founding team should be a very good recruiter. And network is a huge part of that, right? Because you might have this very these new technologies and somebody who's an expert at them that's looking for a new position, but it's just about getting the word out there and finding the fit. So network is huge there. And then, of course, naturally, with all these different things, capital and everything else comes with that. But very interesting, the four verticals you've defined here, and it's very cool to see how you support the whole founder journey.
That's what we want to do, because I think one thing, even with our new investment arm, which is where we are looking to put our own capital into, we've got a thesis. We run according to a particular sector definition and stage definition, etc. But I think one thing we've always tried to do as WeWork Labs, these are the four pillars, but our
Mhm.
ethos and our sort of aim as a platform is we don't think it's enough for us to support our 10 to 12 investments per year, because we have now, by the end of this year, it's going to be about 60 locations across India alone. And that's going
Mhm.
to be over 100,000 members. A good 20% of them would fall into our definition of a startup. And with that kind of infrastructure, we should be looking to do much bigger national level things. So we've always been focused on three sort of main national level problems that we want to solve. So fundraising was at the top. Now we're making some strides there with our own investments and our co-investor network. Second was the mentor network, and third was talent. Because if we can
Right.
actually solve these three layers at a national level, that's a platform for business creation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, it goes into this really, really interesting picture that's now forming in India. I think, even in the last 10 years, the amount of rapid digitization, the amount of capital coming into India, and just the amount of talent, because I think India has always been amazing, very talent rich
Sure.
for hundreds and hundreds of years, like for all of history. But a lot of that talent, unfortunately, in the last 50, 60 years was leaving the country in order to pursue the ideas that they had, and they couldn't necessarily build locally. But I think what's really interesting now is that a lot of the opportunities that this really high graded talent was leaving for can now be found locally as well. So they don't necessarily have to leave to go do those things. And I think those three different areas that you mentioned, right? The great mentor network, the talent, and the capital, now more than ever is highly competitive with the rest of the world already in the last 10 years. And it's only increasing like crazy, right? And so
Very true.
I think,
And to just add to that, actually,
yeah.
that's a really good point, and that's actually we're sort of at a critical juncture of the ecosystem as a whole right now. I think because not only are you seeing the sort of reverse brain drain, I think that's what it's been called in the media, where you have all these
Mhm.
amazing founders who maybe left the country a while ago, coming back, and setting up companies of their own. What we've seen over the last 10 years is you have that initial stock of startups, the Flipkarts, the InMobis, all those initial poster children of the startup ecosystem. All of those founders and founding teams are now, they've exited and they're putting money back into the ecosystem. So that's a
Yeah.
critical stage of evolution, right? Because you have your ex founders and you have these founders building funds of their own. So
Mhm.
that's the whole cycle, and that's going to be smarter capital. That's going to be more dedicated support. That's a fundamental shift in the ecosystem. So you have good talent coming back in and local talent becoming much more mature with the ecosystem, with the innovation ecosystem as a whole. That's a powerful combination.
100%, right? And I think, like I mentioned, like the talent was always there. Like if you go to Silicon Valley today, uh, you know, a lot of great leaders are all former IIT or from great universities in India, and they came to do their masters in the
Right.
US, and when the opportunity is there. But now you're starting to see a lot of not only locally great entrepreneurs, but global entrepreneurs, companies that are actually competing on a global stage with founders who are not only raised in India but like are
Yeah.
building in India as well.
100%.
And I think what there's also something very unique with the Indian ecosystem in particular. But I'd love to get your thoughts before I share mine. Like what do you believe makes the Indian ecosystem very unique compared to the rest of the world as well?
Ah, um, yeah, I think we're sort of it's having its moment right now because there's a bunch of things working in its favor. We just covered one, which is talent. I think by some estimates, it's something like 7 million jobs. I mean, graduates coming out and into the workforce every single year, and I
Right.
think a larger portion of that is in STEM. So we do have a huge potential for entrepreneurship, for innovation, for even not even just entrepreneurship, but talent coming into the job market as a whole, right? So I think that's going to be huge. I mean, obviously there has been some criticism on sort of the quality of talent and the availability of jobs. There's some work to be done there, but I think with a country as diverse as India and as big, if you're talking about 7 million people every single year, that's a huge kind of, and with the language differences, the political differences between states, etc., it's a big problem to solve. But I think it's
Yeah.
moving in the right direction, which I think is a huge, positive for growth. Um, that's on talent. Then I think you're seeing even on capital, right? You have a lot of, like you said, a lot of companies, a lot of countries seeing more, I mean, being more optimistic about India's growth story. So that's a lot of inflow of capital coming in, initiatives like Gift City in Gujarat, big, sort of confirmation of that, where you're going to see a lot of foreign capital coming in like that. Then you have even corporates. The corporate appetite for innovation is changing.
Yeah.
That's great because not only are you seeing corporates create their own funds and being more, appointing CIOs and things like that to keep an eye on the innovation ecosystem. You're seeing a deepening of M&A as a country as a whole. So that's a good sort of acceptance of the entrepreneurship space by the larger private sector. You also have, I think, these softer issues with the ecosystem as a whole. So the whole deep tech surge, right? That's making entrepreneurship more accessible, more easy to get into for budding entrepreneurs. That's huge.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the founder mindset as a whole, like I said, the one, the evolution of old founders who have exited now and are now coming back into the ecosystem versus founders now who understand, because we've gone through all these, we've gone through COVID, we've gone through a bunch of other cycles. So focusing on, founders that know that they have focused on capital efficiency, product market fit, validation, all of these things. So you have a maturing of the founder mindset as well. There are all these trends happening, and I think
Yeah.
all of them are going to mature over the next 2 years. So we're going to see an uptick.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, alongside all of those different aspects as well, like I think just the diversity of ideas that can now be
Yeah.
supported is huge, right? And I had a friend, his first startup was basically he made a WhatsApp storefront for like these local corner markets in
Oh,
India, like where they sell whatever small groceries, and that's something that even 20 years ago, like none of them really even knew anything about technology, and now all of them are on WhatsApp. They all have smartphones, and
right.
something like that could be possible. So there's all this new innovative ideas that can not only be created by people who don't necessarily have the resources, who didn't have the resources to create it, but can because they have a laptop and everything's available online now. Like the infrastructure has been the playing level with the infrastructure has been dialed down, right? But also the people they can serve is very different because
100%.
everybody in India, no matter who you are, has a smartphone, right? And so it doesn't really necessarily matter how well off you are, how to a certain level at least, how where your status is. Like everybody has a smartphone, you can build apps for everyone, which is really really interesting. It's a very interesting paradigm I think that's coming up in India with the whole new diversity of ideas.
100%. And that's also, I think, the most exciting part of the next phase of India's startup story is the emergence of the vernacular world and the regional solutions, right? So all of those, I mean, to a large extent, the previous phase of the ecosystem was focused on the quote unquote English speaking internet, right?
Yeah.
So a lot of them were, folks who had sort of, I mean, could operate in English, could have all these things. But with the rise of vernacular solutions, Gen AI that can translate into other languages and all of that, now I think we're going to see regional innovation go up. And that is by far the biggest market, right?
Hmm.
I mean, you have 20, 30, maybe 40% of India that can works in the metro cities and the big markets, the big cities. But when you start engaging what they call tier two and tier three and tier four India, there's actually an amazing book called Winning Middle India by Bala Srinivasa from Arkham
Okay.
Ventures. And he talks about this amazing, like really well. And when that market is engaged, we're gonna see we're gonna see some really, really interesting innovations come out of India.
Okay, awesome, man. I wrote that down because I'm very interested on this topic.
Right.
But I think this has been really great, and I think one of the other aspects there, right, where if we come back to WeWork Labs, is of course you mentioned those four pillars, and then once an early stage founder has a lot of this stuff established, they can really look to scale and
Yeah.
to make their product big. And I think India is very unique in that way in terms of the way scaling works because of how big the market is, but there's still a lot of general principles that just work worldwide. So I was just wondering, like, what are the strategies that you think startups can use to employ, and you tell your startups to try doing
To employ to scale to
to scale?
scale.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Um, that's interesting. That I've thought about this a lot. I think while scale is hugely important. It's the draw to the ecosystem is because the founder wants the company to scale, the investor wants the company to scale. The entire ecosystem depends on some extent for good companies to scale, right? But I
Mhm.
do think it's a secondary issue in some sense, because I think scale is a consequence of doing a lot of early things right. Right? If you
Mm.
have done your early work, your pre-scale milestones, you've done your, like I said, you've got your product validated, you have your ideal customer figured out, you've got your product, you're working towards product market fit, you've understood the dynamics of your customers sort of wallet share, you know what your path to profit is. All of these things, if you've done real work on, you will, and you found your niche to start with, scaling from that niche becomes much easier. I think the problem, and I mean, one of the issues that founders have to prevent themselves from engaging, I mean, from sort of giving into too much, is thinking that capital is the only thing they need, right?
100%.
Yeah, because that is something, especially in a boom market right now, we're going through this sort of so-called funding winter, so founders have become much more much smarter with their spends. But whenever it's a boom market, so it's sort of like it's the aim is to just grow, and this pressure, I don't blame the founder, because the pressure comes from everywhere. Pressure
Yeah.
comes internally, it comes from investors, it comes from everyone else, to just grow and get a return, right? But if I would say to any founder, and if I could go back in time and tell myself this, I 100% would have loved to hear it, just to focus on these things, spend an unreasonable amount of time almost understanding your customer, understanding why this is a problem that needs to be solved, understanding what the problem solution fit would look like, what the actual solution looks like, and understanding how big that market can actually become. All of this groundwork, and then you have scale, right? Then you when you eventually get to the point where, because investors are going to chase you. I 100% believe if you solve these points and you have clarity on what this growth looks like, you will build a product that's fundamentally different from someone who hasn't done this work. And when that happens, the investors will come to you, you will get your capital, you will get smart capital, you'll get the kind of capital that you need, and scale is going to happen much more naturally instead of being
Yeah.
force fit into a system.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think, on a more personal level, I go through this all the time where,
Right.
when you're always thinking about the future and how things can be implemented, sometimes you go ahead of yourself and you're like, oh, like the product's already, we're already building, but like, how are we going to make this company? Like, what are the roles going to look like? How does the structure work? You think about all these different areas. And then it's really imperative on yourself to sort of reel it back and be like, okay, well, when those problems come, we'll figure it out. I'm sure I'll be able to do it. But today, my
Yeah,
problem is I need to get this product to the customer, and like, how do I make the best product for them based on my
absolutely.
resources today?
Yeah, and
And I
that
think,
pressure is very real. I think I'm always sort of sympathetic and empathetic towards what the founders going through, because they have at the very early stages, you have nothing to motivate your team with other than, maybe you can't pay above market salaries and things like that. So you have to that reason and that motivation to actually help your team come, combined with, okay, if I get capital, I can retain my talent, and then I can figure out other things. I can
yeah,
I've built a good product, I think it works, let me just test it out. There's these real pressures that are in a founder's mind, but I think even before all of that, spend time with your problem and just figure out. Yeah, easier said than done, no
no,
doubt.
100%, right? And I
Yeah,
think, I think like this mindset is it's something you really you address that's very, I think, relevant, and something I see all the time, right? Is a lot of founders I know, a lot of early stage startup founders will go straight into raising money before they've
right.
even validated their idea, they've done the problem or anything like that. They'll say, okay, I have an idea, I think
Yeah,
this is the problem, let me go raise some money so I can build it. And I keep telling them, I'm like, unless you're doing something in deep technology, you can build an MVP or something to at least validate it, and then know what the funds are going towards. Because especially in today's software world, where everything can be done on the cloud, and you don't necessarily need to have a bunch of servers at your house, or like or you're paying for a bunch of servers. You can pay as you go. You can already build without necessarily raising any money. And
exactly.
so I know a lot of founders who went to go raise money. They have a bunch of investors now, but now they don't want to work on that problem. And I'm like,
Yeah,
why? Why did you even go raise? Like, that shouldn't have been the thought process here. And I think that second part you mentioned is also very critical there, which is if you have a good problem and you have customers who are willing to pay for your solution, you'll have the investors come to you, because at the end of the day, that's what investors care about. Can I put money in and double or triple or 10x my return? Like that's the main goal. And if
100%.
there's nothing that signifies that more than customers willing to pay money for your product.
100%. And I think, like you rightfully said, the cost of experimentation is so much lower right now. You
Yeah,
can afford, as a founder, with relatively little capital, to spend time on the problem, build an MVP, figure out if your instincts and your assumptions are right, and then just start from there. Start small, but start thoughtfully, and that's an easier way to think about it. Slightly harder in practice, but definitely the right way to do it.
100%, man. Well, let's take a trip down memory lane. Let's talk about 21 Dojo. It's
Okay.
funny, I can tell, I can tell how close to your heart 21 Dojo is, because whenever you talk to a founder who's been through the journey, like the moment you mention 21 Dojo, I could just see like this elation come onto your face, even though it's probably been years since you've worked on it. But yeah, let's talk about it. So 21 Dojo was created to help gather information and do due diligence for both for investors and for startup founders to get their startups in front of investors or potential investors for capital. And I think you mentioned those 21 factors, which very clever name. I didn't pick up on that, but that's very cool.
Yeah.
Um,
That's the long answer that I tell people, which is true, but the short answer is the domain name was available.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's funny. A lot of people spend hours and hours thinking about a name, but sometimes it can just be as simple as that too, because every
Exactly.
domain is taken nowadays, man. It's very
Yeah.
tough.
Yeah. Absolutely.
um, but I think it's a really interesting platform there, and of course it's like a two-sided marketplace, and I can get into the dynamics of what that entails. But just talking about the product first and talking about those 21 factors that you identified, I think those four pillars that you mentioned, you know, are are very important. But you have all these other factors that investors care about. So how did you guys develop that thesis in terms of these are the 21 factors that we want to identify? And to add an extra layer to that, how do you guys support investors who might think that, hey, these certain factors in the 21 factors is more important to me than somebody else? Like how do you sort of balance that out?
Hmm. Oh, amazing. Okay. Please stop me because I can talk about this
Hey man,
for
it's the stage is yours.
So it's interesting because the reason 21 Dojo even happened in the first place, it was not my explicit intention to become a founder.
Right.
After quitting Deloitte, I was just so fascinated by the founder journey. But the thing is, very few founders, I would say, out there, relative to the size of the market as a whole, were working with the Deloitte, PwCs, the investment banking, the capital advisors of the world, etc. And there was a huge bracket, I think, that didn't know this was an option or for whatever reason chose not to use it, right? So I quit essentially to get into this market and actually just immerse myself to see how to solve these problems. There were a variety of models being worked at the time where people were giving up equity, they were giving up retainer fees, and they were giving up transaction fees just to get that advice, right? So my what I wanted to see, and I wanted this was sort of the calculated risk, is it possible to actually create a scalable platform that helps entrepreneurs build businesses without being so just I mean with keeping in mind that the founder does not have money, right? The money is the most important thing for them. Let's make it truly value adding. So that's the reason I quit. And I remember starting this consultancy, and it was crazy because the only way I would get deals, I was new to the ecosystem, I was new to the country,
Right.
and the only way I would get deals is I had this rudimentary like Google Ads campaign, right? That's all I
Mhm.
had. This was 2014 or 2013. I base and my keyword was fundraising, which if you have as a keyword, you get calls nonstop. I've gotten calls from people who had random parcels of land or wanted random parcels of land looking to fundraise and things like that. So, but I mean, I remember at one point I got something like 17 calls a day just with people
Wow.
who had, yeah. And these were, and the thing is, the bulk, I mean, it was whatever, out of this 70, maybe 7 to 10 of them could be eliminated on the spot because they just weren't relevant. um, but there was a good, say, 5 to 7 starters companies there who understood, and they were actually startups within the stage I was looking at, who needed that kind of advice, etc.
Right.
I wanted to, I wanted to only make money if the founder made got their investment. So mine was only a transaction success fee, right?
Got it.
That's the way I worked. But then I had 5 to 7 companies per day who I needed to see whether, to some extent, whether the basic checks and balances were in place so that they would have a good chance of raising, and then I would get paid. That's the only way my business would work. But so
True.
17 calls a day, about 5 to 7 were ones that warranted deeper analysis. And it took me, I remember, about 5 to 7 days per company to actually analyze it, analyze the industry, get a second call going if I needed more information, etc. It was fundamentally, I know I was on my own at this point. So
Right.
I was drowning in calls and analysis and work. And that's where 21 Dojo actually came from, because what I started to do was I was going absolutely out of my mind. So I was like, I need an easier way to do this. So I made a checklist. I made a checklist of, if these things are in place, those are green flags. If these are there, those are red flags, right? Based
Right.
on my analysis of what investors are looking at. So I started going to meetings and having calls with this checklist and literally asking those questions just to quickly get through my analysis. That worked to some extent. So I evolved that into a more sort of detailed assessment of, if this is the case, check this, and like this whole sort of
Right.
thing. That evolved into an algorithm once I got someone on the tech. Actually, no, my prototype was on Excel entirely. Um, but
Hey, Excel's
so
big, man.
it's huge. It's huge.
Yeah.
It's the absolute love of my life. But yeah, so that algorithm, I mean, quote unquote algorithm, it was a workflow. That is what, essentially, because I was too broke to hire anyone, I couldn't afford to get a full-time analyst on board. I built this system to help me analyze. And
Right.
that's where I got the 21 factors, because I was like, these are the areas that I need to look at. And and then I was thinking, okay, that helped greatly, because I
Right.
need to just plug it in. It actually became just a questionnaire on my website. So founders who needed funding would answer these questions. It would tell me whether I should work with them, or if I can offer some sort of lighter advisory to them while I work on the other ones. So that's what really helped. And that's when I started thinking, if I could eliminate transaction fees as well. If I could find a way to actually package this into a SaaS platform and charge them, like, rock bottom rates, then,
Hmm.
and you sort of become profitable at scale, that would be a better way to do it. So a SaaS, a smart advisory platform, B2B SaaS, is what I initially thought of, and that's what 21 Dojo eventually made. To your second part of your question about how we, so initially it was just a platform to help startups, one, to help me understand who to work with, but once
Yeah.
it became a SaaS platform, to make it automated, so to take out the human completely. You as a founder, you just need feedback, because these are smart, like, founders are really smart. So you don't necessarily need to micromanage them or that kind of thing. You literally have to tell them, these are the things that maybe aren't working, and these are things you need to focus on. And founders will figure out a way. They'll do some experiments and figure out how to solve those questions. So you need to tell them what the questions were that they need to solve. So that's what 21 Dojo did. It scored them on 21 factors, and then told them, these are the sort of areas of concern, and if you can solve them, that was the dojo part, the training to become better. Then investors are likely to be interested in you. And that same information, once a founder decided that they were ready to be discovered by investors, they could just switch on a certain feature in the platform that would expose them to the world of investors, right? So investors could
Mm.
log in, and they could say, customers, they could be like, there could be an investor who's like, yeah, team is important to me, or like, team is very important, it's 80% of my decision. So they overweight the team factors and they
Got it.
underweight the other ones, right? And then they're basically, you as an analyst on the investor side, you are not spending days figuring out who to meet. You're spending 5 minutes on Monday morning scanning the entire ecosystem, being like, these are the ones I want to meet
Right.
this week. And the rest of the time they're working on portfolio. So they're using the same data. We advised founders on what they could be doing, and what they're doing very well, and showing investors which startups probably fit their criteria. So that
Right.
was the idea. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, that is very interesting journey. I think starting off, it was the classic. If you're your own customer, that's the best way of doing a startup. And it seems like in
100%.
this case, you develop the algorithm just from your own work, right? That's
It, uh, it
it's
was it was the most torturous time, but I absolutely loved every minute.
100%. And I think especially in some like especially in India, I feel like this is such a great idea because there's so much signal to noise ratio there where every like I can't even imagine how many startups there are in India,
It's
just based on population. And so how do you even evaluate, cut through the noise and find those gems of the startups?
exactly.
It's a monumental task.
Yeah, you
Um
need tech. You need tech. I'm
you,
still of the belief that data-driven investment needs to happen in the startup world.
100%. And minimum, at least due diligence needs to be done
Yeah,
somewhat with data, right? Like, there's
absolutely.
still certain factors like, okay, this is a no go or this is a go that you can
Exactly.
evaluate before you let more of your experience do the talking. And so, I think it's really interesting what you did there. And honestly, I think it'd be a great book if you wrote like the 21 factors that sort of explain it. I would definitely go buy it. Um, but that's really cool, man. And I think what's really interesting there is because you were working as a consultant in startups, of course you knew the startup side because you played that's like the investor side of the coin, but you have both sides. You had both sides there where you were in the middle, so you both understood the startups and the investors, and that's why something like this could work.
Yeah,
Um, and I think what's really interesting is, you have these 21 factors. The startup founder has the very clear value that they get from the platform, which is they just fill out this form and they get exposed to investors. So how did you build those relationships with investors though? Because that's the super heavy part here, right? Which is the relationships and the trust that the investors have on your platform to make sure
yeah.
that they are getting the right information.
That was tricky. So it required us to reach a critical mass of startups using the platform, and then sort of it was every channel under the sun, right? So I went to events, I did email outreaches, I used my personal network, I did all of that. What really worked was after we got a few of these, we got a good set of investors. I mean, a sort of startups that used the platform, went through it, and a lot of them had said they were ready to sort of be exposed to the investor world, and that's completely in the founder's control, right? Till then, they could stay completely invisible till they worked on whatever they need to work. What we did was we reverse engineered the thesis of the investors. So most investors actually have what they focus on
Yep.
to a large degree of clarity on their website. So we took all of that information and basically did like a matching at scale for all the investors on our database, and just went to investors saying, have you tried 21 Dojo? These are 10 companies that are using our platform that might want to get in touch with you, sort of thing. And that brought in all the funds. So we had 83
Interesting.
funds on the platform at one point. And yeah, I'm still like in touch with a lot of these folks. But that was the big move, and that's what got most of them there. Yeah,
That makes a lot of sense, and I think yeah, I mean, all of them have this mission statement, which is like,
yeah,
okay, to excel, like to help solve the world's climate issues. But underneath that mission statement, they'll have like investing in climate tech startups at seed
exactly,
stage or whatever.
exactly.
So that's like two factors you can just plug into your database and just do a
Yeah,
SQL query and be like, here you go.
100%. And that was, and they would say the sweet spot. They would say, which stage, what they needed to solve before approaching them. There was a lot of good information. So that was our first big exercise, because once we had that information, we knew how to connect them.
Well, and then the cool thing, in this case, is you had all this good credence then with the investors, and that eventually led to you also being acquired. So
Yeah,
it's always a big question there. Of course, you started with the journey. We sort of started there, but at a certain point, you have this question, which is like, should we continue going, or should we be acquired? Should we sell the company? So like, how did you know it was the right time to do that, and what was your decision making process there? I assume it's not 21 factors. I assume it's a little bit different. But
So that's really interesting. Truth be told, I would not have exited at that time. I would have loved to run it for a few more years. There was, I think, we needed to, while we were doing well. We had a good number of startups using it. In fact, the acquisition opportunity came through the platform. There was a startup on
okay,
our platform that was using 21 Dojo, who was being advised by the person who eventually acquired us. So that worked out quite interestingly. But I think where we were as a team, we needed about 2 years more to get our breakthrough revenue,
got it.
and we had cash problems. This was the problem, right? We had a lot of people using it, getting value of it, and this is why I keep saying this is my big takeaway from my entire entrepreneurial journey is spend time on how you're getting to that cash part, right? It was good. I mean, when I got the opportunity, this worked out really well because, one, it was sort of consummated by the platform itself. Two, it gave me, so I had done at this point, there was advisor. I consulted with startups for a bit. The founder journey, I was reasonably, I was living it at the time. The investor part was a missing piece, and I was trying to solve for them as well, right? So the fact that an investor then eventually saw value in the platform and acquired us, I mean, it was the advisory arm of a fund called Indusage Partners. The the fact that that happened gave me that one perspective. So that was the biggest thing to say. If I was going to be acquired, this would be the good, like a good place to, good team to be acquired by, because I'd be able to get that perspective in and actually solve for them as well. Because to sort of add to my previous point, another problem with venture and the startup world as a whole is a VC learns how good a certain bet was 5 years, 7 years, 10 years down the line, right?
Right.
So for you as a VC, you have to go through your sort of ups and downs. What I was trying to solve, the hypothesis was, if I could do a horizontal solving, so all VCs learnings at the same time as used to solve, to help all of them make better investment choices, that would be more useful. So um, I needed that perspective. I needed the investor perspective. So then when they
Mm.
came up, I was just like, yeah, and phenomenal team that I eventually worked with.
Okay, no, that's super interesting, and I guess the cool thing is like no matter what happens now, of course you have this great role of WeWork, but sometime in the future, if you decide to do another startup, now you have both sides. You have the network. Well, obviously you're helping other entrepreneurs with this, but you're
Right.
definitely set if you ever decide to do your own thing and jump back into it. So it's
Oh
a
wow,
very interesting startup that you were working on, and thanks for sharing that journey.
absolutely.
I think we're getting to a point where we should wrap up soon, but. Uh, One quick question, a couple quick questions I have, but one big one is, now that you've been across, the spectrum, you've talked to investors, you're working with early stage startups. Are there any particular sectors that you're really interested in that you
Ah,
think could be really big? Because I know in the U.S. everybody's really excited about AI, but my thesis on that is I think as a technology, of course, it's revolutionary, but the applications in different fields, that's what's really exciting. And so that
absolutely.
doesn't necessarily mean that every startup is an AI company. Well,
Oh
that doesn't
no,
necessarily mean AI has all those different startups. There's still different sectors that they apply to. So anyway, I'm just curious, like what are some of the sectors that you are curious about or
absolutely.
interested in?
I'm so happy you put it that way. I think AI is obviously having its moment, and I think it's here to stay. It's also, there's a lot of hype around it. I think there are um, some things that a Gen AI has done that has opened up massive opportunities, but it's also flattened a lot of other opportunities in terms of content creation, stuff like that. The whole industry is moving, right? So I don't think it's limited to AI, like you said, especially in a country like India, where, like I said before, regional solutions are huge. You still need, like, for example, agriculture. We've seen some amazing startups in agriculture. We've seen amazing startups in sort of just regional language, healthcare, all of these things. So, from the perspective of where I see the opportunity in India, and especially, we've done some work on this as part of WeWork Labs. Um, we have construction prop tech, so anything on the smart city roadmap, which is really exciting. Healthcare remains huge. Something like personalized healthcare at scale is incredible, and I think we're seeing some good moves towards that. Now we're moving slightly past telemedicine and things like that. Financial services and fintech, obviously huge. It keeps getting deeper and deeper. It's moving from the consumer level to the mid office to the back office. So it's you're seeing a lot of infrastructure level changes happening in financial services, which I think is very interesting. Consumer remains a massive opportunity. It is hard to crack. There's D2C that happened in a big way a couple of years ago. It continues as well, but I think smarter solutions are coming now. But other than D2C, you have very tech-enabled retail solutions coming, where you get more granular information on customers, you get on their preferences and things like that, and you're able to tailor what you offer. So really nice ones in retail as well. And then I think SaaS as a whole, it because of the fact that it resides. I mean, it's software and it can reside in so many platforms. It's so accessible. So if you're delivering a solution to the masses, SaaS remains a very, very powerful way to do it. So these are sort of the 5 areas we look at. So I think there's opportunities across the board. I think the tricky part is actually figuring out the founder fit to the problem,
Right.
and the problem fit to the actual solution. I mean, solution fit to the actual problem. Those are the 2 areas. And things like defensibility. That's more from an investor point of view. How
Yeah.
defensible is the solution? But yeah, those would be my 5 areas.
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah, I think, I could go on and on in terms of, I think in terms of like defensibility, I think that's actually one of the big missteps for a lot of AI companies, because their moat is on, or they don't really have a moat because it's on ChatGPT's infrastructure, which,
Exactly.
everybody can replicate. So the real moat is going to come from customers
Yeah,
and from building a specialized platform that isn't necessarily replicable on something like an OpenAI. Or
exactly.
other companies can build this on AI infrastructure. But yeah, I could go on about that all day. But I appreciate you coming onto the podcast. Before I let you go, 2 last questions.
Sure.
The first one is, I know you mentioned Winning Middle India as a book that you
Oh,
recommend
yes.
reading. Is there
Yeah.
any other books that you recommend us checking out, though?
I'm actually currently reading Chip War
Okay.
by Chris Miller. It's just really interesting from the perspective of giving context to the whole deep tech movement, right, in the semiconductor industry, and just how powerful chips and semiconductor industry is in shaping not just the tech space, but everything from geopolitics to individual economies to everything. So it's a really, really fascinating book. I'm enjoying it. It's a little heavy, but it's good.
Yeah, if anybody's wondering why the world cares so much about Taiwan, just give that book a read, and all your
Have you read
questions will
it?
be answered.
100%. Have you read it? Have you read Chip War?
I have not, but actually,
Okay.
I'm gonna write this down too, because that's
Because
definitely an
that's
area that's.
exactly, I think chapter 1 talks about exactly the Taiwan thing. So yeah,
Oh, okay, yeah, no, TSMC is one of the craziest companies in the world, and very few
yeah,
people outside of tech actually know that. So, very
100%.
interesting. I definitely gonna check it out, and maybe I can raise $4 trillion like Sam Altman one day,
7
or
trillion.
attempt to.
7,
Huh?
7
7
trillion.
trillion. Sorry, I missed 3 trillion there. But perfect. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast. The last question I have is just, what are your next steps? What are something we can look forward to, and what do you have brewing in the pipeline that you can share with us?
Ah, um, my next steps are it's the same. It's been the same for
Mhm.
10 years. It's going to be I think the most I'm a huge believer in entrepreneurship. I think it's as our species, I think it's our greatest engine of change is enabling people to create companies, to create systems that drive positive change. And if you can give that kind of power to individuals, it's huge for the entire world. So I'm a huge believer in that, and I think I'm going to continue to work on that problem. I think, and as part of WeWork Labs, that's the ideal setting to actually do that because we have such infrastructure around the country. So I think that's what I'm going to be doing. To look forward to, yeah, I think the takeoff of our investment side, right? And when we have a portfolio of our own that we can really really work deeply with and do some great things with.
Awesome. Well, sounds good. Thank you so much, Arvind, for coming onto the podcast, and for everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in. Until the next one, thank you so much.